August 31st, 1945. The mountains above Kiangan, on the northern end of Luzon. Fog sits low over the ridgelines, the kind that doesn't lift until midday. Somewhere ahead, on a slope called Mount Napulawan, a column of Filipino guerrillas moves through that fog. Men who've spent years learning every trail in these mountains, about to put that knowledge to one last use. Up ahead, in a cave, is General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, the man who took Singapore from the British Empire in 70 days. These men have spent years learning these mountains better than the maps in Tokyo ever did. Today, that knowledge is about to matter more than it ever has. Here's what doesn't add up. By August of 1945, the war is already over. Tokyo has already broadcast the surrender, and Yamashita knows it. He isn't walking down out of these mountains with his hands up. He's hiding. For weeks. In the same mountains where, almost 3 years earlier, an American officer, a man the Army had no record of, a man who should have been either dead or in a prison camp, quietly set up a camp that nobody in Washington knew existed. Same mountains, 3 years apart. One of these two men is in every history book written about this war. The other one isn't. And by the time this story is over, his name is the one Yamashita's army learned to fear the most. What happened during that stretch of time, in this one piece of the Philippines, is what this video is about. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific, there's a decent chance he never heard this name either. So go ahead and hit that like button, not for the channel. For him. For all the guys whose names never made it into the books he might have read. Now let's go back to where this starts. April 9th, 1942, Bataan Peninsula. Major Russell Volckmann is 30 years old. He'd graduated from West Point in 1934, well into the lower half of his class. Nothing that marked him out. Nothing that would have made anyone predict what comes next. He'd been sent to the Philippines in 1940, a senior instructor training Filipino recruits who'd never fired a rifle before, men who, within 2 years, would be among the ones keeping him alive. His wife and young son had been with him until the summer of 1941, when military families were ordered home. The last letter she received from him was written that March, a few weeks before this morning. He didn't know, writing it, that it would be the last word she'd hear from him for nearly 3 years. 8 days before this morning, he was made the Division Intelligence Officer, a desk job, on paper, except there is no desk, only a hole in the ground with a map pinned to the wall of it. The map doesn't matter anymore. Word comes down the line that morning, passed from officer to officer the way bad news travels in an army, quietly, and then all at once. Bataan is surrendering. Up and down the line, men start doing what soldiers do when an order like that comes. They break down their weapons. They stack them. Some of them cry. Most of them don't say anything at all. They start walking toward a clearing where the Japanese have told them to assemble. Volckmann doesn't walk toward the clearing. He has a map, a worn one, folded and unfolded so many times the creases have gone soft and white. He folds it once more and puts it inside his shirt. A canteen, half full, a compass, and 2 other officers standing near him, looking at the same clearing everyone else is walking toward, and not moving their feet. None of them say the word out loud. What they have is a direction. North. Behind them, the sound of thousands of men falling into formation gets quieter as they walk the other way. Boots in mud, voices calling names, taking count, making sure no one's missing. They are missing. Nobody will notice for a while. That first night, they don't risk a fire. They lie in the dark, listening to the jungle, which has its own sounds, and underneath those sounds, faintly, something else. Loudspeakers. The Japanese have set up speakers near the surrender point, broadcasting instructions to the columns of men laying down their arms. The words don't carry clearly this far into the trees, just the rhythm of them, repeating hour after hour, until the three men fall asleep to the sound of their own army's surrender being announced to people who are no longer part of it. In the morning, they keep walking. Volckmann's map covers roads and supply depots, not the kind of terrain three men avoiding every road are about to spend the next several days in. The compass tells them which direction is north. It doesn't tell them what's between here and there. What's between here and there, it turns out, is most of Luzon. 3 days later, they're hungry in a way that doesn't go away with one meal. By then, the terrain has already changed twice. The roads they avoided gave way to rice paddies, and the rice paddies have given way to foothills. Open ground where three men in what's left of American uniforms can be seen from a long way off. They move at night when they can, and during the day, they wait in whatever cover the ground offers, which on the central Luzon plain in April isn't much. A family takes them in. Somewhere along the way, word passes from one household to another, and a meal appears that nobody remembers being cooked. Nobody explains why they're helping. They just are. It happens again, and again. Some nights it's a meal and a place to sleep under a roof. Other nights it's just a pointed finger, a direction, a name of someone to find in the next village, and nothing else, because that's all the person can safely give. Eventually, the chain leads to Mount Arayat, a single isolated peak rising out of the central Luzon plain, visible for miles in every direction. It's become a stronghold for a Filipino resistance movement called the Hukbalahap, peasant fighters with their own grievances against the Japanese, their own organization, their own reasons for being in these hills that have nothing to do with the United States Army. For three Americans who've spent the last several days assuming that any organized group of armed men means the end of this, arriving at Arayat is its own kind of whiplash. These are armed men. They are organized, and they are not the enemy. They feed Volckmann and his two officers, shelter them, pass them further north, toward people who might be able to do more for three American stragglers than a peasant militia can. Nobody in Washington will ever know the names of the people who did this. From Arayat, the route turns toward the mountains in earnest, out of the cane fields and into terrain where the trails climb instead of cross. The handoffs continue for weeks. A camp run by a man named Lapham, then one run by a man named Cushing. Each time, there's a quiet test that's never spoken out loud. If these people wanted to turn three Americans over to the Japanese for a reward, they could. Every time, they don't. More than once, a Japanese patrol passes close enough to hear voices, the particular rhythm of boots on a trail, and the three Americans go still, flattened against whatever the jungle offers, until the sound fades. Nobody in these camps trains for this. They've simply learned, the way people learn anything when the alternative is worse, how to disappear into ground they know better than anyone hunting through it. This goes on for months. Spring becomes summer, becomes the start of the rainy season, and the three men who walked away from that clearing in April are still walking, still depending on people whose names they may never fully learn, in a country that was never their own and has by now become the only place any of them has left. September 9th, 1942. 5 months after walking out of that clearing on Bataan, Volckmann and his men reach a camp in northern Luzon and find something they haven't seen since April. Other Americans standing up, armed, planning something. Colonel Moses, Colonel Noble, a captain named Calvert, a lieutenant named Murphy. Volckmann and his two officers look like men who've been living off whatever the country could give them for 5 months, because that's exactly what they are. Boots held together with whatever was on hand. Uniforms that stopped being uniforms somewhere around month 2. There's no dramatic reunion here. Just a handful of men in worn-out uniforms looking at each other, realizing at the same moment that the war isn't over for any of them. It's been 5 months of depending on strangers for food, for direction, for the simple fact of staying alive one more day. None of that disappears just because there are other Americans standing in front of them now. But something does change, the particular weight of being the only ones who know what's happening to them. That weight, at least, is shared now. Volckmann doesn't take command of anything. Moses is senior. Moses gives the orders. Volckmann is one piece of a structure still being built, district by district, out of whatever men and weapons can be scraped together across the mountains of northern Luzon. December 8, 1942. Volckmann sets up his own camp, a small town in Ifugao province in the central mountains, the kind of place most maps don't bother to label with anything more than a dot. Kiangan. He doesn't know what it will become. There's no flag raised, nothing marking the date. In practice, it means a handful of huts built into a hillside, hard to spot from the air, with trails leading out in 3 directions, and none of them obvious from any of the others. It's not much. It doesn't need to be much. It needs to still be there next year. He picks it because it's useful. Somewhere south of Kiangan, in a garrison office, a Japanese officer is writing a report for Tokyo. The report says the area is pacified. Attached to it is a short list. A supply convoy that didn't arrive on schedule. 2 soldiers listed as missing. Last seen on a trail 2 days outside the garrison. No contact reported. No bodies found. The report doesn't connect these things. It doesn't mention Kiangan. It just says, pacified. And underneath that word, in the same file, sits a list of things that don't add up. Filed and forgotten. By someone with no idea what's 3 days' walk to the north. It's a strange thing, looking at a map. For almost anyone, Kiangan is just a name. A dot in the mountains. The kind of place you'd drive past without slowing down. But for one man, on one day in December of 1942, it was the last decision he had left to make. Everything after that, for the next 3 years, would be about what he built on top of that one choice. I think about that sometimes. How many places on a map are like that for someone? Not famous, not marked, just the spot where, on one particular day, somebody ran out of other options and made the only choice that was left. June 9th, 1943. A runner reaches Volckmann's camp, having moved fast enough through the hills that it shows, covering in one day what should have taken 2. The kind of exhaustion that isn't just physical, the look of someone carrying news he doesn't want to be the one to deliver. Moses and Noble are gone. Captured by the Japanese somewhere to the south. Nobody knows exactly how or when. Just that the 2 senior officers who've held this loose collection of districts together for almost a year are no longer in the field. Volckmann doesn't say much. There's no meeting where someone formally hands him command, no vote. It's simpler and colder than that. Moses is gone. Noble is gone. Volckmann is the senior officer left in northern Luzon, who's still in the field, still in contact with the other districts, still alive. So now it's his. Roughly 2,000 men, scattered across a stretch of mountains the size of a small American state, most of them armed with whatever they captured, stole, or hid before the surrender. Some haven't heard from a higher headquarters in over a year. Some aren't sure there still is one. Some have buried their uniforms entirely, and look to anyone passing through like farmers. A few of them have stopped thinking of themselves as part of an army at all. They've become something closer to armed communities, defending the same villages they've lived in for a year, trading captured rifles for rice, settling into a kind of life that has its own rhythm and doesn't particularly need a colonel from Bataan showing up to change it. Volckmann's job, that summer, is convincing them otherwise, not by ordering them, but by giving them a reason to think there's still a war worth being part of. He spends the rest of that summer doing something that doesn't show up in any of the photographs from this war. He walks, district to district, camp to camp, talking to men who are technically under his command but have never met him, have no reason to trust him, and in a few cases have started operating as if there's no command structure left at all. At one camp, the local commander has been running his sector for months without orders from anyone, deciding on his own which Japanese patrols to hit and which to let pass, because nobody above him has been in a position to say otherwise. When Volckmann arrives, the man doesn't salute right away. He waits, watching how this stranger talks to the men, what he asks about, what he doesn't ask about. By the time Volckmann moves on a few days later, nothing has been ordered, and nothing has been refused. But the unit is part of something again. In a way it wasn't a week earlier. November 24th, 1943. A meeting in the field, a handful of officers, a map redrawn so many times it's mostly tape and pencil marks. By the end of it, the scattered units have a shape. 7 districts. Calvert leads the 1st. Barnett holds both the 2nd and the 3rd. Prager has the 4th, Manriquez the 5th, Lapham the 6th. The 7th belongs to Volckmann, shared with a man named Blackburn. It isn't an army yet. But for the first time since Moses and Noble disappeared, it's something that can be pointed at on a map and make sense. None of it solves the basic problem these districts have been living with for almost 2 years. Men getting sick with nothing to treat them, units running low on ammunition with no way to resupply, and no way of knowing whether any of this still matters to a war effort that, for all they know, has forgotten this part of the world entirely. Volckmann isn't immune to any of it. Malaria doesn't check rank, neither does dysentery, or the dozen other things that come from drinking whatever water is available, and eating whatever can be found. He keeps moving, not because he's healthier than the men around him, but because there's nobody else positioned to do what needs doing. Early 1944, a new headquarters goes up in the hills of western Bungay province, and in August of that year, something arrives that hasn't existed here in a year and a half. A radio set, working, tuned, capable of reaching the Southwest Pacific Command, coordinating the entire effort to retake the Philippines. For 18 months, this stretch of mountains has operated in total silence. Every report, every estimate of Japanese troop movements, USAFIP-NL, has gathered has gone nowhere. No way to send it. No way to know if anyone remembers these districts exist. The operator works the dial. Static. More static. And then a signal back. It's not a dramatic message. Coordinates. An acknowledgement of receipt, the kind of routine transmission any headquarters sends to any unit it's in contact with. But it means someone, somewhere south of these mountains, just heard from them. For the operator sitting in that hut, it's the first confirmation in 18 months that anyone outside these mountains still knows this war is happening here. Up until that moment, there was no way to be sure of that. There was only the assumption, the only one that made any of this worth continuing. From this point on, every piece of intelligence USAFIP-NL gathers, troop positions, supply routes, garrison strengths, has somewhere to go. October 30th, 1944. 2 months earlier, in August, President Manuel Quezon had died in exile in New York. His vice president, Sergio Osmeña, became president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines that same month, a government with a flag, a seal, a seat at Allied conferences, and almost nothing else. No territory, no capital that isn't occupied, just a title, and the people who hold it. One of those people is a woman named Esperanza Osmeña, Sergio's wife, and she's living in Baguio. Baguio City sits up in the mountains, a summer retreat before the war, the kind of place with proper houses and gardens, a world away from the jungle camps most of USAFIP-NL has been living in for 2 years. The Japanese still hold it. Esperanza and her children have spent the entire occupation in a city full of Japanese officers, under watch. There are children in that house, old enough to know not to talk about their father where anyone outside the family can hear, young enough that years of occupation are most of what they remember of being a kid. If the Japanese garrison in Baguio ever realizes whose family is living in that house, Esperanza Osmeña and her children stop being civilians under occupation and become something far more valuable: leverage against a government in exile that exists mostly as an idea. Nobody has to spell that out to the men planning what comes next. Everybody already understands it. A small group of USAFIP-NL guerrillas moves into the city that night. Baguio isn't a jungle camp. It's streets, checkpoints, a Japanese garrison that knows the layout of the city better than any mountain trail. Every step of this has to look like nothing is happening at all. They find the house. They get the family out. There's nothing about that night that would look right in a movie. No shootout, no chase scene. The operation works because of how quiet it stays. By the time the Japanese garrison realizes the president's wife and children are gone, the guerrillas are already miles away, moving through the dark toward territory they control. By morning, the Japanese garrison has lost something it didn't know it had, and gained nothing in return but the knowledge that it happened. For a government that exists mostly on paper, that's not a small thing. It's proof the paper still means something. By the start of 1945, the war comes to them. The 6th United States Army lands on Luzon in January. And for the first time since this all started, USAFIP-NL isn't fighting alone. Real supply lines open. Weapons that have been scavenged, hidden, or fought over for years are suddenly backed up by shipments that arrive by the truckload. Rifles, ammunition, radios, boots. Volckmann's command, which started this campaign at around 8,000 men, grows past 18,000 over the months that follow. It stops being a guerrilla force in the way it had been since Kiangan. It starts being something closer to a division, fighting alongside the regular army at places with names that mean nothing to most Americans and everything to the men who were there. Besang Pass, Mayoyao Ridge, Baksil Ridge, mountain passes and ridge lines where what's left of Yamashita's army tries to hold a line against the advance. And the men attacking that line are, in some cases, the ones who learned this exact terrain, because they never had any other choice. The fighting at these places is slow and costly, the way mountain fighting always is. There's no single dramatic turning point to point to. Just ridge after ridge, taken the way ridges get taken, a few hundred yards at a time, dug in, fought over, held. For men who've spent years fighting in civilian clothes, moving at night, answering to nobody most of the army's ever heard of, there's something almost disorienting about fighting in the open, in uniform, with artillery support, as part of something that shows up on a map at 6th Army headquarters. The war they'd been fighting alone has finally become the war everyone else is fighting too. By April, Baguio itself, the city USAFIP-NL had slipped into and out of in the dark 18 months earlier, falls to the advancing Allied forces. This time, nobody has to sneak. What changes isn't the terrain, it's who's losing it, and who's been here long enough to know exactly how. By August of 1945, there isn't much of an army left to call an army. Manila fell back in February. Yamashita pulled what remained of his forces north and east into the Cordillera, the same mountain range that's been home to USAFIP-NL since the end of 1942. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers retreating into terrain they don't know, pushed by an enemy that does. By July, what's left of the Shobu Group, Yamashita's command, is scattered across the Cordillera in pockets, cut off from each other, living on whatever the mountains provide, which for an army this size isn't much. The same mountains that gave USAFIP-NL just enough to survive on for years are now doing the opposite to the men who once occupied this island. There's a kind of symmetry to it that nobody on either side has time to notice. Tokyo has already broadcast the surrender. Word reaches the mountains within days. Yamashita doesn't come down. For the men who've spent the war in these hills, this isn't a new kind of enemy. Hungry, scattered, hiding in terrain that swallows units whole. Except now, it's the most senior Japanese commander in the Philippines doing the hiding. August 31st, 1945. A patrol moves up through the fog toward Mount Napulawan. Guerrillas who know every trail, every ridge, every place a man could hide in these mountains, because they've used those same places themselves. They move the way they've always moved in this terrain, spread out, quiet, checking the ground ahead before committing to it, doing exactly this against exactly this kind of enemy, in exactly this kind of place, for as long as any of them can remember. What they find over the next 2 days is a cave, a handful of staff officers, and a man who, 3 years ago, commanded an army that took Singapore faster than almost anyone in the British Empire believed possible. He doesn't look like that man anymore. Months of retreat, sickness, and a campaign that never had enough of anything have done what years of fighting against him never quite managed. This isn't a parade ground. It's a cave on a mountainside, a patrol of men in worn uniforms, and a general with nowhere left to retreat to. September 2nd, 1945. Yamashita is brought down out of the mountains, taken to Camp Spencer on the coast at Luna, La Union. The first time in weeks he's seen anything other than jungle and rock. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you don't know where to look on a map. The mountains where Yamashita was found sit in the stretch of the Cordillera, where on December 8, 1942, a major with no orders and no headquarters picked a small town called Kiangan to set up a camp. Nobody planned it this way. It's just geography. The same ridgelines, the same valleys, the same handful of mountain communities that fed and hid and guided American stragglers in 1942. Except now, they're the ones doing the finding. 3 years, same mountains. The next morning, Yamashita is flown to Baguio. What happened there, the table, the documents, the men waiting for him, that's a story this channel has already told. This isn't that story. This is the story of what those mountains were doing for the 3 years in between. Colonel Volckmann comes home in December of 1945. He's been gone for over 5 years. For nearly 3 of them, his wife and son had almost nothing. That letter written before Bataan fell, and then silence, until word finally reached them in January of 1945. By then, the radio in the mountains had been talking to the outside world for 5 months. It just took that much longer for a message to travel the rest of the way, through channels, through mail, through a war that was still being fought, before it reached a farmhouse in Iowa. He comes home to Iowa, quietly. No ticker tape, no crowd, just a train platform that's been empty for years, and a family stepping back onto it. 2 months later, he's back in the Philippines, finishing administrative work nobody else can do, closing out a guerrilla command that on paper was never supposed to exist in the first place. In 1954, he publishes a memoir. He calls it We Remained. 2 words, and anyone who knows what MacArthur said when he left the Philippines in 1942 will understand exactly what those 2 words are answering. The book doesn't sell the way MacArthur's name would have. For decades, it sits mostly in military libraries and on the bookshelves of men who served alongside him, passed from one veteran to another rather than handed to the general public. After the war, Volckmann spends years arguing, to the Army's own leadership, in an era when guerrilla warfare is still treated as something other armies do, that what happened in those mountains wasn't an accident. That it could be taught, organized, built into doctrine on purpose, before the next war instead of during it. He gets his way. The result is the Army's first dedicated unconventional warfare unit, the 10th Special Forces Group, the beginning of what the world will eventually know by a different name. He doesn't do it alone. Two other men, Aaron Bank, who'd run operations behind German lines in Europe, and Wendell Fertig, who'd led his own guerrilla resistance on Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, are part of the same effort. 3 different wars, 3 different stretches of jungle or forest, each one improvised under conditions nobody back home had trained them for, and the same conclusion, arrived at independently and then argued for together, that what they'd had to invent under impossible circumstances could be taught, on purpose, to men who'd never had to improvise anything in their lives. None of it happens without the other side of that camp at Kiangan. The thousands of Filipino guerrillas who fed, hid, fought alongside, and eventually outnumbered the handful of American officers in USAFIP-NL by a margin of hundreds to one. Their names mostly don't appear in any American account of this war either. Green Berets. Volckmann retires as a brigadier general, a rank he never held during the war that made him, earned afterward quietly, the same way almost everything else in his career happened. He dies in 1982, in his early 70s, not on a battlefield, not in the news, just an old man who'd spent his last decades mostly out of the public eye, the way he'd spent the war itself. By then, the Green Berets he'd helped create were already a recognized part of the Army he'd once been listed as missing from. Today, there's a soldier somewhere wearing a green beret who has probably never heard the name Russell Volckmann, never read We Remained, has no idea that part of what they're trained to do. Operate alone, build something out of nothing, in places no conventional army would go. Traces back to a decision made in a tree line on Bataan in April of 1942, by a major who didn't have a plan. Just a direction. North. Most people who watch the surrender footage from the Missouri, or the photographs from Baguio, will never know that the men who made both of those moments possible spent years doing it without a uniform, without orders half the time, and without anyone back home knowing they were even alive. A man who refused to walk toward a clearing, who spent years in mountains most people couldn't find on a map, who set up a camp in a small town because it was useful, with no idea that the most wanted man in the Philippines would one day be found in those same hills by people who'd learned those trails from him. And then he went home, wrote a book, and spent the rest of his life making sure what he'd learned didn't disappear with him. It's a strange kind of legacy, invisible while it's happening, and easy to overlook afterward, because the whole point of it was never to be seen. Somewhere out there, someone's father or grandfather served in the Pacific and came home and barely talked about it, except maybe once, at the dinner table, in a story that never made it into any book. If you've heard a story like that, about someone nobody's ever heard of, doing something nobody wrote down, put it in the comments. Those stories are disappearing. Let's not let them.